Most people think they understand what shocking means when it comes to true crime, but this case redefines it completely. Because the story of Tracy Wilemon is not just unsettling, it is the kind of case that crawls under your skin and refuses to let go. At first glance, nothing about her life suggested the nightmare that was quietly forming around her. There was no dramatic warning, no obvious danger, no moment where someone could say, "This is where it all went wrong." And that is exactly what makes this case so terrifying. A woman disappears, and instead of immediate chaos, there is hesitation. Instead of clear answers, there are strange gaps, uncomfortable silences, and details that feel slightly off, but not alarming enough at first. As days pass, those small inconsistencies begin to pile up, and what once looked like a simple situation slowly transforms into something far darker. Investigators start realizing that the truth is being hidden in plain sight, that the people closest to the situation may not be telling the whole story, and that every new discovery only raises more disturbing questions. This is not a case built on fast twists or dramatic confessions. It's a slow, chilling unraveling that exposes how manipulation, secrecy, and human cruelty can exist right beneath an ordinary surface. And the deeper you go into Tracy Wilemon's story, the harder it becomes to believe how long the truth stayed buried, and how easily it could have remained hidden forever. What began as concern turns into horror, and by the time the full picture comes into focus, it becomes clear that this is one of those cases that permanently changes how you look at people, trust, and the idea of safety itself. Tracy Wilemon's life did not begin as a tragedy, and that is what makes this case so deeply unsettling. She was not someone living on the edges of society, not a stranger drifting through the background of a city where no one would notice if she vanished. She had routines, relationships, responsibilities, and a presence that mattered to people around her. To the outside world, her life appeared ordinary, even unremarkable, and that illusion of normalcy would become one of the most dangerous elements in the story. Because when Tracy disappeared, nothing about the situation immediately screamed emergency. There were no frantic 911 calls reporting violence, no witnesses claiming they saw something terrible happen, no obvious crime scene that demanded instant attention. Instead, there was confusion, the kind that allows time to slip away quietly while something terrible remains hidden. At first, people assumed there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she left on her own. Maybe she would show up soon and everything would return to normal. But as hours turned into days and days stretched into an unbearable silence, the absence of Tracy Wilemon stopped feeling temporary and began to feel deliberate, as if something or someone had erased her from the world with intention. Those closest to her began replaying recent conversations in their minds, searching for clues they might have missed, moments that felt normal at the time but now carried a strange weight. Small details began to stand out, a tone of voice that felt off, a plan that was never followed through, unexplained change in behavior that had been brushed aside because no one wanted to imagine the worst. Investigators entered the case cautiously, treating it as a missing person situation rather than a crime. But even in those early stages, something felt wrong. Information didn't line up cleanly. Timelines shifted depending on who was asked. Stories changed subtly, not enough to trigger immediate suspicion, but enough to create unease. The more questions were asked, the more the answers seemed to slide just out of reach. It was as if the truth was wrapped in layers, each one designed to look harmless on its own, but collectively forming a barrier that protected something dark underneath. As the investigation deepened, the case began to transform. What had once looked like an unexplained disappearance started revealing patterns, emotional tensions, unspoken conflicts, and relationships that were not as simple as they appeared. People who should have been desperate for answers seemed oddly composed. Others were too eager to explain things that had not yet been questioned. Every interview added information, but also added contradictions. And slowly, investigators began to understand that this was not a case that would unravel quickly. It was one that required patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable possibilities. As time passed, hope and fear existed side by side. Hope that Tracy would still be found alive, and fear that the reason she hadn't been found yet was because someone had made sure she wouldn't be. Each passing day made the silence louder. Each unanswered question felt heavier. The community watched closely, sensing that something was deeply wrong, even if they couldn't articulate why. And then came the moments that changed everything, discoveries that could no longer be explained away. Realizations that forced investigators to reframe the entire case, and revelations that shifted suspicion from the unknown to the unthinkable. What emerged was not a story of chance or misfortune, but one shaped by human decisions, by control, and secrecy, by actions taken with the belief that the truth could be buried indefinitely. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Tracy Wilemon's disappearance was not an accident. Not a mystery born of randomness, but the result of something calculated and cruel. And with that realization came a chilling understanding. The reason this case is so shocking is not just what happened to Tracy, but how easily it happened, how long it went unnoticed, and how close the truth was to being lost forever. As the investigation pressed forward, the idea that Tracy Wilemon might simply return on her own began to fade. Law enforcement started digging deeper into her personal life, retracing her last known movements, conversations and interactions, not just from the day she vanished, but from weeks and months before. This is where the case began to take on a heavier, more disturbing tone. Investigators learned that Tracy's life, while outwardly ordinary, was marked by emotional stress and complicated relationships that few people fully understood. There were tensions that had been kept private, conflicts that were minimized, and dynamics that appeared stable on the surface, but were fragile underneath. Friends described Tracy as someone who tried to keep the peace, someone who didn't easily share her fears or struggles, which made it difficult to know just how much pressure she may have been under. This lack of visible distress initially worked against the urgency of the investigation, allowing crucial time to pass while the situation was still being assessed. But as interviews continued, patterns emerged that could no longer be ignored. Certain individuals became central to the timeline, not because of dramatic accusations, but because their proximity to Tracy placed them at key moments when she was last seen or heard from. Their accounts were detailed, almost rehearsed, yet small inconsistencies began surfacing when those accounts were compared side by side. A statement made early on didn't quite match a later version. A time estimate shifted slightly. An action that seemed insignificant at first suddenly felt important in hindsight. These were not the kinds of contradictions that immediately prove guilt, but they are the kinds that tell experienced investigators to slow down and look closer. As days turned into weeks, the emotional toll of the case intensified. Tracy's absence became a constant presence, haunting every conversation, every search effort, every unanswered phone call. Her loved ones oscillated between hope and despair, clinging to the possibility that she was still alive, while slowly confronting the growing fear that something irreversible had happened. Vigils were held, flyers were distributed, and the community began to rally, driven by the shared unease that comes when a familiar face is suddenly gone. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, investigators were starting to reclassify the case in their minds, shifting from the question of where Tracy might be to the far more troubling question of what someone might have done to her. This shift marked a critical turning point, because once the focus moved toward foul play, every detail took on new significance. Objects, locations, and behaviors that once seemed irrelevant were re-examined under a harsher light. The investigation expanded, and with it came discoveries that chipped away at the illusion that this was a simple disappearance. Evidence began to suggest deliberate actions taken to mislead, to delay, and to control the narrative. The idea that someone could be orchestrating events from behind the scenes sent a chill through those working the case. It raised the possibility that Tracy had trusted the wrong person, and that trust had been exploited in the most devastating way. As pressure mounted, the emotional strain became visible in those closest to the case. Some withdrew, others became defensive, and a few appeared almost detached, as if trying to distance themselves from the gravity of the situation. Investigators noted these reactions carefully, understanding that guilt does not always look like panic, and innocence does not always look calm. Human behavior under stress is unpredictable, but patterns still exist, and those patterns began pointing in a direction no one wanted to accept. The realization slowly set in that Tracy's disappearance was not just a tragedy, but a betrayal, one carried out by someone who believed they could outsmart the system. And as the case moved closer to that truth, it became clear that uncovering what happened to Tracy Wilemon would require not just evidence but the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. A lie that had been hiding in plain sight since the very beginning. As investigators continued peeling back the layers of Tracy Wilemon's life, the case began to feel less like a mystery and more like a slow confrontation with something deeply uncomfortable. Every step forward seemed to confirm that the truth was not missing, it was being concealed. The focus shifted toward understanding motive, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the quiet spaces where control, resentment, and fear tend to grow. People close to Tracy described moments that now felt unsettling in hindsight, conversations where she sounded unsure, decisions that seemed influenced rather than freely made, and emotional shifts that were subtle enough to be dismissed at the time. None of it was explosive on its own, but together it painted a picture of a woman navigating pressures that were largely invisible to the outside world. Investigators began reconstructing Tracy's final days with painstaking care, mapping movements minute by minute, comparing phone records, routines, and witness statements. What stood out was not chaos, but order, a sequence of events that appeared almost too clean, too controlled. This raised a disturbing possibility. If something terrible had happened to Tracy, it was not the result of a sudden loss of control, but of planning. The idea that someone could methodically remove another person from existence without immediately raising alarms is one of the most frightening aspects of this case. It suggested patience, calculation, and a chilling confidence that the truth would never surface. As scrutiny intensified, relationships once considered stable began to crack under pressure. People who had initially cooperated openly now hesitated. Answers became shorter. Emotions hardened. Investigators noticed defensiveness where there had once been reassurance, and this shift did not go unnoticed. At the same time, the lack of physical evidence created its own form of torment. Without a clear crime scene or definitive proof, every theory remained just out of reach, forcing investigators to rely heavily on behavioral analysis and circumstantial patterns. This kind of case tests not only skill, but endurance. Each day without resolution weighed heavily on everyone involved, especially those who cared about Tracy. Hope became fragile, sustained more by determination than optimism. The investigation did not stall. Instead, it evolved, becoming more focused, more deliberate. Investigators revisited earlier assumptions, challenged their own biases, and asked questions they had avoided before. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the narrative began to shift. The case was no longer about finding Tracy. It was about confronting the reality that she may never be found, and that justice would have to come in another form. This realization marked one of the most painful moments in the investigation, because it forced everyone to accept that the truth once uncovered would not bring relief, only clarity. But clarity matters, because without it, silence wins. And in Tracy Wilemon's case, silence had already taken far too much. With each passing week, the investigation into Tracy Wilemon's disappearance became a study in patience, persistence, and the sometimes brutal reality of human behavior. Every lead had to be scrutinized, every statement weighed for meaning beyond its surface. Investigators began to notice patterns that were subtle but undeniable, timing that didn't add up. Locations visited that had no clear explanation, relationships that carried hidden tension. What once seemed like ordinary interactions now took on an almost sinister undertone. The closer they looked, the more it became clear that the facade of normalcy Tracy had lived behind was fragile, and that fragility had been exploited by someone who understood how to manipulate appearances. As the evidence accumulated, the picture of what might have happened to Tracy grew sharper, but it also became darker. There were moments that made even seasoned detectives pause. Clues emerged not in dramatic bursts, but quietly, an overlooked message, a forgotten witness, a minor inconsistency in a timeline. These seemingly insignificant details began connecting in ways that hinted at intent, control, and premeditation. It became clear that Tracy had not simply vanished, someone had ensured that. The realization was horrifying, because it suggested a deliberate effort to conceal both the act and the actor. Family and friends lived in a liminal space between hope and fear. Each day without answers created emotional turbulence, a mixture of anger, guilt, and helplessness. They replayed every interaction with Tracy, questioning whether something had been missed, whether warning signs had been ignored, whether a chance to prevent this had existed. This kind of emotional weight is a hallmark of cases like this, where the disappearance is not sudden or violent, but calculated. The torment is not only in the absence, but in the uncertainty of what really happened. Investigators continued to pursue every lead with relentless focus. They examined phone records, financial transactions, and patterns of communication, looking for anything that could illuminate Tracy's final movements. Every step seemed to lead to more questions, yet each question brought them closer to the uncomfortable truth. What became increasingly apparent was that Tracy had trusted the wrong people, those she believed she could rely on. This trust, manipulated and betrayed, was central to the case. The person or people responsible had used the ordinary rhythms of her life as a cover, blending malice into familiarity so seamlessly that discovery seemed impossible. Then, pivotal evidence began to emerge. The clues were not dramatic, but methodically a collection of small facts that, when pieced together, formed a narrative that no longer allowed for doubt. The nature of this evidence forced investigators to reconsider everything they had assumed, to question each interaction Tracy had in the days and weeks before her disappearance. What had once seemed benign now suggested intentional obfuscation. And as the evidence solidified, the focus of the case shifted decisively. It was no longer just about finding Tracy. It was about understanding how she was taken from the world, and ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. The realization of premeditation added a chilling weight to every subsequent action. Each discovery brought both relief and horror: relief in knowing that the truth could be uncovered, horror in understanding the deliberate cruelty behind it. Investigators pressed forward, methodically reconstructing timelines, analyzing behaviors, and confronting uncomfortable truths about the people Tracy had trusted. It was painstaking work, and it required confronting deception, betrayal, and manipulation at a level that is rarely as explicit in missing person cases. Finally, after weeks of tireless investigation, patterns became undeniable. A narrative that had been obscured by lies, distraction, and silence emerged with clarity. The case had been deliberately hidden in plain sight, shielded by those who assumed no one would look closely enough to notice. The shock of this realization was not only in the cruelty of the act itself, but in the audacity of attempting to bury the truth in a routine, everyday life. Tracy Wilemon's story, once a quiet disappearance, had become a testament to the fact that evil can be methodical, calculated, and terrifyingly patient.